Hello everyone. My name is Jonna, and I'm from Team 7105 Swift Intergalactic Space Squirrels, formerly known as Swift Intergalactic Space Llamas. We are from Bass, North Carolina, and we have been a team for 7 years. So we have a lot of notebook experience and knowledge, which we hope to share with you today. So this class is going to be on how you can meet the rules and requirements of the engineering notebook so that you can be competitive for awards. We're going to talk about why the engineering notebook is important, some different ways you can format your notebook, the general rules and requirements, the cover, the summary page, the table of contents, 3 required sections, so the engineering section, and team plan. And then we're also going to talk about some extra sections and information that you can include. So if you have any questions throughout the presentation, just hold them until the end, because we will have about 20 minutes after the presentation for Q&A. And we're going to use a website called slide.o, I think. So we're going to use that for questions. So don't post your questions in the chat. So to start off, we're just going to talk a little bit about why the notebook is important. So the notebook is really important because it records your journey as a team throughout each season. It's nice to look back at the past journals and remember your experiences. It's also important to learn how to document well, because chances are that you're going to have to document in your future career. And so learning how to create a journal will help you in the future. Lastly, your notebook is required to win most of the awards at competition, so you won't be eligible for any awards if you don't submit a journal. Now we are going to talk about some general formatting options. There are 2 main options, so you can either write out your journal by hand, or you can type it electronically and then print it. The judges don't prefer a specific method, so when choosing which method you are going to use, just consider the pros and cons. So some nice things about handwritten journals is that they're very unique and personal to each team, and the different handwriting styles prove to the judges that there are multiple people working on the journal. It's also easier than electronic journals to include sketches. With electronic journals, you either have to take pictures of your drawings or scan them into a computer and then put them into the journal. But with handwritten journals, you can draw sketches directly into the journal. You also don't have to print out handwritten journals, which is nice. So depending on where and how you print your journal, it could be expensive. 2 years ago, we printed our journals at Staples, and that costed about $50. So finding a high quality and affordable printer may be a problem, but if you write your journal out by hand, then you won't have to print it. So some bad things about handwritten notebooks are that sometimes the handwriting can get a little messy, and so it's hard to read, and it's hard to stick with your format and keep it consistent throughout the entire journal. Also, even though it's easier to include sketches in handwritten journals than in electronic, it's hard to include photos. So in electronic journals, you can put photos directly into the journal, but in handwritten journals, you have to print them out and then glue them in. So handwritten journals are better for sketches, but worse for photos. It's also harder to access handwritten journals. Since there's only a single hard copy, it's hard for multiple people to work on it at the same time, and you can't access it wherever and whenever you want. However, with digital journals, it is very easy to access, and you can access it from anywhere at any time, and multiple people can work on it at the same time. So you also don't have to worry about handwriting because you just type it out. And it's also very easy to modify and rearrange and to reorganize your entire journal. The only downsides are that it's not as personal, and also the judges can't really verify whether or not everyone contributed. And then also, if you do an electronic journal, the printing may be expensive. So also, a side note for electronic journals, be sure to print them at least several days in advance of your competition. A couple years ago, we weren't able to print our journal until the night before, and one of our mentors had to print it at his house, so we didn't have it until the morning of the competition. And we had to put all the pages into the binder on the way to the competition. So just be sure you have plenty of time to put your journal together and print it. So now we're going to talk about some general notebook rules. These are the bare minimum requirements for your notebook to be eligible for awards. And these are ranked in order of importance. So if you don't follow the two first rules that say required next to them, your journal will be immediately disqualified and you won't be eligible for any awards. The 3 required sections, you won't be disqualified if you don't have them, as far as I know, but you almost definitely won't win any awards. The last few are not very important. It's just better that you follow them. So first, you need to have your cover on your journal, and your cover has to have your team name and number on it. If you do not have this, then your journal will be immediately disqualified. Also, you need to have a summary page, and we're going to talk more about that later. If you don't have a summary page, then you will also be immediately disqualified. There are 3 required sections. You need to have an engineering section, a team section, and a team plan. And we're going to talk more about those later also. The rings of the binder that you use cannot be more than 3 inches. If you have more pages than can fit into one binder, then you can submit 2 binders. However, judges will not look at more than 2 binders. So if you have more information that can fit into 2 3-inch binders, then you should probably cut back on your information. Most teams only submit 1 binder. It's not necessarily better to submit 2 since judges look for quality over quantity. Even if all your information could fit into 1 binder, though, you might decide that you want to submit 2 if you like the organization that it gives you. So some teams, for organization's sake, separate all the engineering and team information. So they put all the engineering information into 1 binder and then all the team information into the other. Some teams also put all their meeting entries into 1 binder and then everything else into another binder. So you could use 2 separate binders to help organize your information. Just know that judges will not look at more than 2. So throughout your entire journal, if there are any blank pages or sizable blank spots, you need to draw an X through them with a pen. Or if you're making an electronic journal, you could fill it with a box or some other picture or something. So that's just to show that the judges that you weren't supposed to have something in there and it fell out. And it's also to make sure that you don't go back and add stuff later. So there isn't a minimum size for spaces that you have to X out, but probably if it's about 2 inches tall or taller, then it should be X'd out. So finally, the pages inside your journal should be printed front and back if you print your journal, or written on front and back if you wrote out your journal. So that's not required, and it won't hurt you very badly if you don't do it. It's just a good recommendation. The judges like to see that you're not wasting paper. So, but whether you choose a handwritten journal or an electronic journal, they both need to include the same information. So now we're just going to walk through the journal cover to cover and discuss each of the different things that it should contain. So first comes the cover. The only rules are that it needs to exist and the team name and number need to be on it. So the cover is probably the easiest and funnest parts of the journal to make. It's just a nice chance to get creative. So after your cover comes the summary page. And the summary page is very important because it's the judge's guide to your journal, and it helps your team stand out to the judges when you're no longer in an interview. Also, if you do not have a summary page, then your journal will be immediately disqualified. So your summary page should be about 1 to 3 pages long, and it should go on the inside of the front cover of your binder. So first, it needs to include a short summary of your team. And this summary should just be about what you think makes your team unique and what you most want the judges to know about your team. So your summary page should also include bullets of what you consider to be the highlights of your season, in addition to your paragraph about your team. And then your summary page also needs to include recommended pages. So the judges look at your recommended pages to see highlights of your journal and your season. You can recommend up to 8 pages. You don't have to use all 8 pages, but I strongly suggest that you do. Even if you only have 8 pages in your journal, you should use all 8 recommended pages, because the judges use the recommended pages as a guide. So to leave the strongest impression with the judges and emphasize your strengths, you should use them all. So when choosing which pages you want to recommend, you can either choose pages that highlight your strengths, or you could tailor them to win a specific award. For example, if you want to win the Control Award, the majority of your recommended pages could be about programming and the calculations behind your programming. If you don't have a specific award that you would like to win, or if you don't even know what your strengths are, then you could choose aspects from each of the different aspects of the challenge, outreach, programming, mechanical, and team. And that just creates a nice balance and shows that you're strong across all areas. So once you choose your recommended pages, on your summary page, you should list the names of the pages or what they contain. So if you choose a page from the budget, then just call it budget. If you choose a page from your outreach where you volunteered for an FLL tournament, for example, then you can just say FLL volunteering. And then next to each title, you either give the page numbers for each of them or number them 1 through 8. So then you put the tabs on each of your recommended pages and number the tabs either 1 through 8 or with the page number, depending on which way you chose to do it for the titles. Yeah, so just, it's easier though if you number it 1 through 8 rather than use the page numbers though, I think. And if you tab them, it's not required that you tab them, but you really should, because that just makes it easier for the judges to see where the pages are. So next is the table of contents, and there's not a lot to say about that. It should just include any major sections that you have and the page numbers where each section starts. And then it should also include either important pages from the main sections with their page numbers or subsections of the main sections and the page numbers of the subsections. That's just so that the judges can kind of see at a glance what each of your major sections contain. So to the right is an example of a table of contents. It's not from our team, it's from Team Lightsabers. So their journal is one of the 4 example notebooks FIRST provides. Actually, if you're a rookie or a rookie team or a rookie member on a veteran team, then I would suggest going and looking at those journals, because they give you a very good idea of what a complete journal should look like. So that's the table of contents from Team Lightsabers. As a side note, the way they number their journal sections here is very helpful. Instead of numbering the pages straight through the entire journal, they assign a letter to each of their sections and then do the page numbers for each section separately. And that's really helpful because if you add pages to a section, you don't have to go through and renumber the pages in all the other sections, which you would have to do if you were numbering the pages straight through. So that's it for the table of contents. Next is the engineering section, and that's the first required section. So the engineering section needs to contain your meeting entries, which we'll talk about in a minute, coding development, which we will also talk about later, and then it should also include lots of math and calculations. So you should have math from both your engineering and your programming. Some common engineering calculations that you can include are gear ratios, torque, and any measurements that you do to plan the layout of your robot. So programming requires a lot of math, like almost all the time, so it's pretty easy to include programming math. The hardest math to include is the engineering. Lastly, you can include extra information besides your meeting entries and coding development just to make your engineering section a little more interesting. Some common additions that I've seen are a game or a build strategy. So you just plan out what objectives you want to achieve in the robot game and how you plan on achieving them. And then you could also include a timeline of your robot development, or you could include a finished robot overview that just shows your finished product and then maybe some pictures of your robot in action. It's not required that you include extra information besides the meeting entries and coding development, but it is nice. So now we're going to talk about the meeting entries. Every time your team meets, you need to record what you did in a meeting entry. Every meeting entry needs to include the date, the time that the meeting started, and the time that the meeting stopped. It also needs to include work notes and the initials of whoever wrote the entry. So when recording your work notes, you should write about what you did and why you did it, but it shouldn't just be a log of all the things that you tried. It should also explain in detail why you tried the things that you did and why you think that they did or didn't work, and then what you plan to do next. Entries should also include lots of pictures and sketches and math. So take pictures and make sketches of everything. Having lots of pictures will make your journal like 10 million times better. Also, if your team does CAD, you should include CAD. CAD is kind of just like sketches in that it shows that you planned out your robot before you built it. So you should also include some extra information if you want. I know a lot of teams do attendance logs in their entries. You could also have a reviewer who looks over the entry when it's finished. If you have a reviewer, then you should include the reviewer's initials. It's just nice to, you could also include your meeting goals if you want, because that's just nice to show what you aim to achieve in the meeting. And then in your work notes, you can show whether or not you actually met those goals. And then lastly, you can include a summary or a review of what happened in the meeting, and then any next steps that you plan to take in your next meeting. So here are some examples of how you can lay out your meeting entries. This was from our very first year as a team in the block party season. So this example doesn't have all of the required content that we talked about. It doesn't have the meeting start and stop times. Also, it has the writer's name. Technically, you're supposed to have the writer's initials. However, it does have the date, the work notes, pictures and sketches, the meeting goals, and an attendance log. So this example is from our 5th year as a team in relic recovery. This one meets all the requirements. It has the date, the meeting start and stop times, the work notes, sketches, and attendance log, and meeting goals. So this one has the writer's initials, although they are a bit hard to see. You may want to put them in a more conspicuous spot. So this last entry is from Team Lightsabers, and this entry meets all of the requirements as well. It has the date, the meeting start and stop times, the work notes, meeting goals, and pictures. At the bottom, you can see the X. Like I said earlier, if you make your journal electronically, then you don't have to write in an X with a pen. You could fill it with something else, like they use sheet metal here. So here are some rules that you need to follow when making your entries. When you start a new entry, it should either start on a new page or be separated from the previous entry by a line so that the judges can see where the entry begins and ends. If you write your entries out by hand, then you have to write them in pen. If you glue pictures into your journal, then you need to outline them against the paper with a pen and also write your team number on the back of the picture. And that's just in case it falls out, because then the judges can see that there was supposed to be a picture there. And if they find the picture, then they know who it belongs to. Also, if you're writing your entries and make an error, or if you find an error in one of your entries after you print it, then just cross out the error with a single line with a pen and write down the date that you made the correction as well as your initials. And just some general tips on making entries. Always write the entries the day of the meeting. Even if you procrastinate to only the next day, you will have forgotten a lot of the details of what happened and the meeting won't be as detailed. So also try to have everyone write entries And that doesn't mean that everybody has to help write every single entry. It just means that you should take turns writing them because the judges want to see that everyone participates. So that's it for the meeting entries. Next, we're going to talk about the coding development. A lot of teams separate the programming from the engineering and put it into its own section. So you can do that if you want to. The most important part of the coding development is to describe the process. So what you tried, why it did or didn't work, and then what you tried next. Also, programming includes a lot of math, so be sure to include that even if it's not super complex. For example, even if you don't have any sensors or encoders, if you have a mecanum drive, then you can show how the math works out for the drive motors. It is difficult to record the programming process well. One way that I have seen teams do it is to have meeting entries, but then also separate programming entries to describe in detail the programming process. Another way you could do it is to have a timeline to show your progress in programming, or you could have a page or paragraph describing each of your different programs and why you made them the way you did. So a lot of teams include some of their programs in their programming section, but you don't have to if you don't want to, and you don't have to include all of your programs. It's more important to describe the process. If you do though, it is nice to include animations describing what the program does at different points in the program. So there are two ways you can do your annotations for your programs if you decide to include them. You can either write them directly into your code or in the margins of the code. So the example on the left is from Team Lightsabers, and that shows the first method. The green lines are their annotations, and they just type them into the program itself. So the example on the right is from our team 3 years ago. It has the annotations written in the margins of the code. So since we're talking about code, I want to mention the control award briefly. As you may or may not know already, if you want to be considered for the control award, then you need to find the control award form for the current season and fill it out. So you can either print out the form and write in the information by hand, or find a digital copy, fill that out, and then print it. Some teams put a form into Google Docs and share it with other teams. So if you would rather type it, then you just need to find an editable form. But the reason that I want to talk about the control award is that it needs to be submitted with the journal. So when you're finished with it, it needs to go on the inside of the front cover of your binder with the summary page. So that's it for the coding development and the engineering section. And now we're going to talk about the next required section, which is the team and outreach section. So a lot of times teams split this section into two sections, one for the team and one for the outreach. But whether or not you decide to do that, it should include bios for each of your members and each of your coaches and each of your mentors. And we're going to talk more about that later. It should also include any sponsor information that you might have. You may or may not have sponsors, but if you do, then you should include it. And of course, it needs to include your outreach information. So in your member, coach, and mentor bios, you need to include the name, only the first name, not the last name, the age, team role, and any reasons that that member, coach, or mentor had for joining first. It's also nice to include some personal fun facts and pictures just to make it interesting. So I'm going to show you some bio examples. These first two ones are from our team. The one on the left is our first year, and the one on the right is from our 6th year. So as you can see, they both include the name, the age, the team role for each member, and then they also have a brief paragraph explaining what each member does on the team and why they joined, with some fun facts and pictures. So next, we're going to talk about the outreach. So whether you decide to put the outreach in its own section apart from the team section or not, it needs to include a description of each outreach activity or event that you did. And some common outreach activities include mentoring junior FLL or other FTC teams, teaching classes for other teams, volunteering at FLL competitions, and giving robot demonstration. But whatever outreach activities your team does, you need to record each individual event. And each event should have their own page, or at least their own paragraph, describing what you did and also why it was important and meaningful. So you should have lots of pictures from all of your events. It's important to have photographic evidence for all of your outreach. Also, you should try to record how many hours you spend on outreach. Even if you don't record the hours for each of your individual events, which you should try to do, at least try to record the total hours that you spent on outreach. You should also try to calculate your impact. So like the hours, you should try to calculate the impact for each individual event. But if you can't do that, then at least try to calculate the total. So impact is harder to keep track of than hours, because with hours, you just have to keep track of how long you ran each outreach event. But with impact, depending on what sort of outreach it is, you may have to estimate. So for example, we ran 2 summer camps last year, and we were able to get the exact impact for that because we knew how many kids signed up. But then we held a demonstration at our town Spring Fest, and we had to estimate for that what our impact was. So a helpful way to keep track of outreach hours is to make a Google form that you send out to all your team members. And then whenever somebody does outreach, then they just fill out the form explaining what they did and for how long. So we did that last year, not for all of our outreach, just for the mentoring, because we found that mentoring hours were the hardest to keep track of. We had a form and you could just go into it and fill out your name, what level of first you were mentoring, so junior FLL, FLL, or FTC. And then you could fill in how many hours you mentored for. All the information was collected into a Google sheet for outreach. And so we were just able to easily keep track of how many hours and how much impact we spent on outreach. So here are some outreach examples. The left example is from our 3rd year, and the right is from our 5th year. So these outreach pages don't have the impact in hours, and they don't have the event title anywhere on the page, so it's a little bit hard to see at a glance what the outreach is about. But they do have event descriptions and pictures, which is good. So the example on the left is from our 6th year. It has an event title and an event summary, as well as the date, the hours, and pictures. It does not have the impact, however, but it does have the hours, so that's good. The right example is from Lightsabers. That one also has pictures and an event title and summary. However, it does not have the impact or hours. So that's it for the team and outreach section. The next required section is the team plan. So your team plan can consist of either a business plan, a strategic plan, or a sustainability plan. You can include one or more of those, or you can just choose one, and you can choose whichever ones you want. I know that a lot of teams do business plan, and also a lot of the times teams do either a business plan or a strategic plan along with a sustainability plan. So we're going to talk about the business plan and sustainability plan. We haven't really done a strategic plan in the past, so we're not going to talk a lot about that. A strategic plan is just supposed to specify in detail what your goals are and how exactly you plan to achieve them. Actually, the SWOT analysis in the sustainability plan kind of does that. So some of the information in each of the different types of plans kind of overlaps. So if you choose to do a business plan, there are some things that it needs to contain. So first, it needs to contain a budget. And when making your budget, you first estimate how much you're going to spend in each aspect of the challenge, and then record what you actually spend. So for example, you would estimate how much you're going to spend on travel, competition registration, robot parts, etc. And then you keep track of how much you actually spend for each of those different categories. Your budget should also include your income and your source of income. If you get money from fundraising, you should record what fundraising you did and how much money you raised. If you have sponsors, then you should include how much they gave you, their logos, and possibly other information. You're supposed to include any sponsor information that you have in your team section, but you should also include it here in the budget. So your business plan should also include a summary of all your outreach events. Because you have already recorded the outreach in your outreach section or team section, it doesn't have to be super long. It should just be a brief description of each outreach event that you did, why it was impactful, and then also why you chose to do that outreach event. If you recorded your impact in hours, then you should also repeat that here. So your business plan should also include your team structure, and that should also be in your team section as well, but you should repeat it again here. Just describe what roles you have on your team, how you manage your team, and just how your team works in general. Lastly, you need to include any contact information or social media information that you have. So you could just list the names of any social media accounts that you have and give your email and possibly a website if you have one. The reason for including the contact information is so that you can actually use the business plan when seeking new sponsors. So you can actually give your business plan to a potential sponsor, and then they can see what your team does, your outreach, and then they would have your contact information. And that's why you would include your contact information. So to the right is a page from Team Lightsaber's budget from their business plan. As you can see, they have the sources of their income with how much they planned on receiving from each source, and then how much they actually got. And then they have how much they plan to spend on each different category of the challenge compared to how much they actually spent. Okay, so here's some more examples. On the left is a page from Team Black Frog's budget, and their journal is another of the example journals that First provides. So their budget is very similar to Lightsabers, except that it has a nice reflection on the end with notes on the budget. On the right is the contact information page from one of our past business plans. And that just has our social media accounts, website, email, mailing address, and contact information. So before we go into sustainability plan, I just want to mention one tip for a business plan. So go look at FRC business plans. In FRC, they don't have a journal, they just have a business plan. So they're very long and detailed. FTC business plans probably shouldn't be quite as long as FRC ones, but go look at FRC business plans because they will give you a very good idea of what you should have in your business plans. A lot of teams share theirs online, so they should be very easy to find. Finally, we'd like to talk about the sustainability plan. So you have to include either a business plan, strategic plan, or sustainability plan in your team plan so that your team plan could just be a sustainability plan if you want, but a lot of teams have sustainability plans in addition to a business plan or a strategic plan. So the first thing your sustainability plan needs to include is your team structure. And this is the same as is required in the business plan. You just need to write about your team roles and how your team works. So next is the SWOT analysis. To conduct a SWOT analysis, you first need to brainstorm what your team's strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats are. So to the right is Team Lightsaber SWOT analysis from their budget. Strengths are just anything that your team does well or sets you apart from other teams. And common strengths are sponsors, size of the team, and growth. Weaknesses are sometimes a little bit hard to separate from threats. Weaknesses are just anything that your team doesn't do very well, but don't necessarily threaten your existence as a team. So for example, one of our weaknesses that we determined last year was that we didn't have any CNC tools, and some of our other tools, like our 3D printer, are low quality. So having low quality tools doesn't, it hurts your team, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't continue as a team. So that's weaknesses. Opportunities are pretty self-explanatory. They're just anything that already have or possibly will lead to greater growth as a team. Threats are similar to weaknesses. but they are anything that is actually a risk to your existence as a team and could possibly prevent you from competing in years. So common threats are loss of sponsors and loss of members. After you determine what your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats are, the next step is to create an action plan. And that just, in the action plan, you just decide on what actions you could possibly take to eliminate your weaknesses and threats. So that's it for the SWOT analysis. Next, you need to lay out both your short-term and long-term goals. So short-term goals are just for the current season. Some common short-term goals are making it to the state competition, learning more about a certain subject, gaining a specific sponsor, etc. Then long-term goals are for multiple years. So next, you need to address how you train your rookie members. On some teams, the older members teach classes for the newer members. Sometimes mentors teach the new members. However your team teaches new members, you need to record it in your sustainability plan. So lastly, how do you plan on staying competitive? And that's closely related to the previous question, because teaching new members necessary skills is a large part of staying competitive as a team. But this could also include other information though, such as any new steps that you plan to take to expand other aspects of your team, such as outreach and fundraising. And so to end our presentation, I would just like to give you some ideas of other sections and information that you can include in your journal. And this extra information could be put into their own sections or into other existing sections. So we already talked about how you can split the engineering section into programming and engineering, but you can also split the engineering section even further. So you could have a CAD section if your team does CAD. You could also include electrical information, so you could describe how your robot is wired and why you wired it the way you did, as well as any problems that you might have faced when wiring. You could also make an entire section for engineering and programming calculations. So you should have any calculations and math that you recorded, recorded in the meeting entries. But you could also make an entire separate section for it, because it's just kind of cool to see an entire section dedicated to math. So you could also include a finished robot overview or robot design section, which we kind of talked about earlier. It could contain a description of your finished robot, what it accomplishes, how it accomplishes it, and maybe with some pictures of it in action. So we also talked earlier about how you could split the team section into team bios and outreach. You can also include more team information, like your team scouting process. So if your team scouts at competition, you could describe the way your scouting works, your game strategy, and what you look for in other teams. If you use fillable scouting sheets, you could include one to show how you scout and strategize. You could also make competition lessons learned section, which just records each competition that you went to, how it went, and then what you learned from your experience. And like the extra engineering information, this extra team information can either go all in one team section or in their own separate sections. And so those are just extra information or extra sections that you can include besides the main requirements that you need to be eligible for awards. And so I think that is the end of the presentation on how to meet notebook rules and create a strong notebook. We're going to have about 20 minutes for Q&A. So we're going to go to the website called slide.o, and then you just ask questions and you can vote on questions, and whichever questions has the most votes, I will answer first. Okay, so how do you obtain sponsors? That's not related to Notebook too much. Most of our sponsors we've had for many years, so I wasn't really there when we searched them out. If you do outreach though, like demonstrations at town fairs, like we did a demonstration at our town Spring Fest, and so we see a lot of businesses there. So if you go to demonstrations like that, then you can search for sponsors there. And then, like I said earlier, when you have a potential sponsor, you can use your business plan to help introduce yourselves. So yeah, you could also search out sponsors. You could just walk into a business and then ask them if they want to sponsor you. So yeah. Does the length of the engineering notebook matter? Once you get to a certain point, it matters, but judges look for quality over quantity. So if you have a short notebook that's really, really good and answers all the rules and requirements really well, and your math is really good and your descriptions are really good and you have lots of pictures, then that's more important than having lots of pages. So like if you had one binder that was really good, that's better than having two binders that are just kind of mediocre. So once you get to a certain point in quality though, then I guess more is better, but quality over quantity is what you want to go for. So what does your team include in the team history section? What do you mean by team history section? If you want to clarify that, then I can answer that. I'm not sure what you mean by team history section, but how long do you keep outreach from prior years? So you're not supposed to keep outreach from prior years, and I suppose you could include it if it directly affects your outreach from this year. You're supposed to only include outreach from the current year, but if a certain outreach event, like if you're building on it over several years, then you might need to include that. But most of the time, you're only supposed to include outreach from the current year. How do you get everyone to work on the notebook? Yeah, so what's best for that is to have a single person who is like really diligent, and they make sure that somebody writes an entry every day or every meeting. If you have one person, that one person shouldn't write all the meeting entries. They just need to make sure that somebody writes a meeting entry for the meeting. So that's just kind of how we do it. We have one person that makes sure that an entry gets written for each day. Also, it is hard to get everyone to write entries because some people just don't want to. So you can just try and brainstorm some different ways to incorporate them into the notebooking process. So one way you could do that is to have like an official photographer, and they'll just take pictures, and even if they don't want to help write, then they'll be taking pictures and helping make the journal in that way. And then also a reviewer comes in. If you decide to have a reviewer, that's just like a person that looks over every meeting entry when you're finished writing it. And so you can have an official reviewer if they don't want to help write the entry itself. So is $15,000 a good budget for a whole year for everything, food, parties, and everything? So every team will have a different size budget depending on how many sponsors they have and depending on how big their team is and just how many sponsors they're able to get and how many fundraising opportunities they have. I would say 15,000 is pretty good. And a lot of years we've actually only had like 5,000 for our team, and we were able to make it really well. But yeah, so 15,000 is a good budget. In your budget though, you need to show how much you set aside for each of your different aspects. So you need to think about how much you're probably going to spend on competition, registration, and each of the different things, and then record how much you actually spent. How do you encourage all members of the team to be actively involved in maintaining the notebook? So I kind of answered that earlier. You can have one person that makes sure that everyone participates. And then you can also have different roles for the notebook. If people like taking pictures, then they can be the photographer. If they like to design stuff, then they can design page formats. It's just, you need to figure out what people are interested in and then how they can use those interests to help with the journal. What awards has your team won? A lot. I don't remember all of them. I've only been on this team for 3 years. The team has been a team for 7 years. This past year, we won Inspire at States. Last year, we won 3rd Inspire at States. Yeah, I can't remember all of them. So, do you have a section just for math? So you can if you want to, and it is kind of cool. So you should have all of your math in your meeting entries, but you can also have a separate section just for math. That is kind of cool, but it should also be in your meeting entries. I found that sometimes my team has so much reflection that you get lost in all the words, and it's hard to pinpoint what was learned. So for that, you could have, like I said, you could have a summary and review at the end of the daily entry. And so that would just explain really briefly what you did in that meeting. You could also have competition lessons learned or even lessons learned from the entire season. And that will just like summarize some of the really big things that your members have learned from that season or from a competition. Also, if you use pictures, then it'll show your progress with less words. Yeah, so a summary or review at the end of the meeting entry will help a lot with that. And I am going to release slides for the slideshow actually on Almond Robotics website, First Online. I think they're going to be posting the slides with this video. So you'll have access to that. Are there any other questions? Do you put unrelated events in the notebook, like parties and fun team events? Yeah, that is a good thing to put in your notebook because it kind of shows team spirit, and it is kind of hard to decide what section to put that in. You could put that in meeting entries. You could also even make like a separate section on the end just for fun, or you could put it into your team section. So you could have an extra section on the end for fun where you put stuff like that in just to show your team spirit, or you could put it into your team section to show your team spirit. So yeah, it is nice to include fun stuff like that though. Are there any other questions? So should you include sustainability issues in the notebook? Yeah, that is a very good thing to include. So in your sustainability plan, you need to lay out your SWOT analysis. So that would have your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And so your weaknesses and threats are probably going to be your sustainability issues. And then in your action plan, you'll have to show how you overcome those issues. So for example, if team members leave, that's a sustainability issue. So you can show how you overcome that by like teaching your new members. For an overview of your robot, do you mean just general overview of what the robot does, or like individual sections for each mechanism of the robot? Both. What I mean is it's just an overview of your finished robot. So your meeting entries show your process, but then your finished robot overview would just show your finished product. And so you could have a general overview of your robot and or individual sections for each mechanism. But the finished robot overview is just supposed to show what you arrived at from your meeting entries. Are there any other questions? Okay. So if that's it, then I think we'll be done. So thank you for coming, everyone. And I hope you learned a lot, and I wish you good luck in your season. So thank you for coming.